Sarah Whitmore slammed her last silver dollar onto the auction table so hard the coin spun and didn't stop until it fell off the edge onto the dirt. Nobody picked it up. They were all too busy staring at her. She was 26 years old, 3 months out of widow's black, and every man in Willow Creek, Montana, was waiting for her to fail. Behind the fence, the great black stallion they called Black Thunder was screaming, kicking, plunging, throwing himself against the rails like he intended to die before he let anyone own him again. Sarah didn't flinch. She pointed at the horse. "I'm buying him," she said, "and I'm leaving with him today." If this story already has you gripping your seat, you haven't seen anything yet. We'd love it if you'd subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you don't miss a single moment of what happens next. And before you go any further, drop a comment and tell us what city you're watching from. It means the world to us to see how far this story has traveled. Now let's get into it. The dollar was still spinning in the dirt when William Harrington laughed. He was a big man. William Harrington, wide shoulders, thick hands. The kind of laugh that came from a place deep in his chest where he kept all his certainty about how the world worked. He had been running the largest cattle ranch in Ravalli County for 22 years. He had hired men, fired men, buried 2 foremen, and outlasted 3 droughts. He believed with the conviction of someone who had never once been proven wrong in public that he understood horses, land, money, and women in that order, and roughly with that much regard for each. He looked at Sarah Whitmore standing in front of him, with her chin raised and her jaw set, and her dark eyes fixed on the pen where Black Thunder was still throwing himself against the fence rails. And William Harrington laughed the way a man laughs when something so absurd happens that his brain genuinely cannot process it as a threat. "Ma'am," he said, wiping his eye, "I don't think you heard what I said about that animal." "I heard you fine," Sarah said. "He put 2 of my best ranch hands in the doctor's office. One of them still can't lift his right arm above his shoulder." "I understand." "He broke through a double-reinforced gate last spring. Took out a section of fence that took 4 men 3 days to build." "I understand that too. He ain't been ridden. Not once. Not ever. Not by anybody." Harrington stepped a little closer, lowering his voice like he was offering her something private, something almost kind. "Now I don't know what your situation is, Mrs. Whitmore, and I don't mean any disrespect to your late husband. God rest him. But whatever you're thinking right now, whatever you came here believing you were gonna do, I need you to hear me when I tell you that horse will kill you. He ain't broke. He ain't gonna get broke. We've had trainers out here. 2 of them. Professional men. They left without their money and without their pride, and one of them left without 2 fingers on his left hand." The crowd that had gathered at the rails of the auction yard, maybe 30 men, a handful of women, several boys who'd climbed up on the fence to get a better look at the commotion, had gone very quiet. They were the kind of quiet that happens when people sense something worth remembering. Sarah looked at Harrington for a long moment. Then she looked past him at Black Thunder. The stallion was standing still now, chest heaving, nostrils wide and dark, his whole body trembling with something that had no clean name. He was black, from nose to tail, the kind of black that has blue in it when the light hits right, and he was big, bigger than a working horse. Had any business being 16 hands easy, maybe more built like something out of a story somebody told to scare children into behaving. His eyes were wild, but they weren't mean. That was the thing. Sarah had been looking at those eyes since she arrived, and she knew the difference between mean and afraid, because she had spent most of her adult life learning it the hard way. "He's terrified," she said. Harrington blinked. "Beg your pardon?" "That horse. He's not vicious. He's scared. There's a difference." She turned back to Harrington. "I want to buy him. $1. That's what you were going to sell him for. I heard you talking before the bidding started. You said you'd take whatever you could get before you sent him to the slaughterhouse." The word dropped into the crowd like a stone into still water. A few of the men shifted. One of the ranch hands looked at the ground. That's not exactly." Harrington started. "Is it true or isn't it?" A beat of silence. "We were considering our options," he said carefully. "Then consider my $1. She bent and picked the coin up from the dirt herself. She held it out to him flat on her palm, steady as a woman who had made her decision 3 days ago, and had spent every hour since arriving at it from every possible angle and finding no reason to change it. Harrington looked at the coin. He looked at her. He looked at the crowd watching him. He took the dollar. The eruption that followed was not applause. It was something stranger, a wave of sound that moved through 30 people at once, half amusement and half discomfort. The collective noise of a group of people watching something they cannot quite categorize. Several of the men were already shaking their heads. One woman near the back, Eleanor Marsh, who ran the dry goods store and had strong opinions about everything, said loudly, "Lord have mercy! That's the Whitmore widow. Somebody ought to stop her." Nobody did. Sarah had already turned toward the pen. Getting Black Thunder out of Harrington's ranch yard was the first real fight of what would become a very long war. The horse did not want to be led. He did not want a halter. He did not want the rope Sarah carried or the soft words she offered, or the particular kind of patient stillness she had taught herself to hold in her body when she was working with an animal that needed time. He wanted to run. He wanted to destroy. He wanted in the way that frightened creatures always want to make himself so dangerous that nothing would ever come close to him again. It took Sarah an hour and 40 minutes to get a halter on him. She did not force it. She did not use a twitch or a blindfold or the long pole one of Harrington's hands offered her from a safe distance, clearly expecting her to fail in a way that would at least be interesting to watch. She stood at the edge of the pen, and she breathed slowly, and she waited, and when the horse came close enough, not because he trusted her, not yet, but because his panic had begun to exhaust itself, and curiosity is the thing that comes after exhaustion in a creature that is not fundamentally broken. She moved her hand in a slow, deliberate arc and let the rope settle against his neck, like it was nothing more than a touch. He exploded sideways. She held on. He came around again wilder. She moved with him, not pulling, not fighting, just staying attached, keeping the pressure constant and low and unthreatening. Letting him discover that this particular rope attached to this particular human was not going to chase him and was not going to hurt him, that it was simply going to be there, the way weather is there, the way ground is there, simply a fact of the situation that had to be reckoned with rather than defeated. 30 minutes later, she had the halter buckled. The crowd had thinned. Most of the men had gone back to their work, deciding the entertainment wasn't worth the time. A few had stayed. Harrington himself was still there, leaning against the fence post with his arms crossed, watching her with an expression that had started as amusement and was now something else, something more careful and more considered, though he would not have admitted it if asked. When Sarah finally led Black Thunder out of the pen, walking beside him at the exact right distance, close enough to keep contact, far enough to give him the space his body was begging for, Harrington said quietly, "He ain't gonna be any different tomorrow, you know. This is just him being tired." "Maybe," Sarah said, not looking back. "Or maybe it's the first honest moment he's had in a while." She walked the horse the 4 miles to her farm. She did not ride him. She did not try. She walked beside him the whole way, talking to him in a low, steady voice about nothing in particular. The weather, the state of the road, the way the light was coming through the cloud cover to the west. The horse trembled the entire way. His ears never stopped moving. But he walked. And he did not run. That, Sarah decided, was enough for the first day. Her farm sat 2 miles west of Willow Creek, on a parcel of land that had once belonged to her husband's family. Daniel Whitmore had inherited it from his father, and had spent 6 years trying to turn it into something. He had been a good man, kind and hard-working and full of plans, but he had been unlucky in the specific, unforgiving way that the Montana Territory specialized in. A late frost had taken 2 harvests. A cattle disease had moved through the county. And then the mining accident at the Henderson claim had taken Daniel himself on a Tuesday morning in March, leaving Sarah with $37 a leaking barn, a broken water pump, unpaid debt to the Willow Creek Savings and Loan, and the very firm opinion of almost every person in town that she ought to sell the land and find somewhere easier to survive. She had not sold the land. She had also not found anywhere easier. She had done what she always did, which was get up the next morning and figure out what needed to be done next. The barn needed repair before Black Thunder could stay in it. Sarah had known this before she brought him home, which was why she had spent the 3 days before the auction patching the worst of the gaps in the walls and reinforcing the gate. It was not a good barn. It was a barn that had been told firmly to hold together a little longer, and was doing so out of something like stubbornness. She put the Stallion in the paddock beside the barn that first night. She stayed with him for 2 hours, sitting on the top rail of the fence, with a lantern, not talking now, just being there. She listened to him move around the enclosure. She listened to him stop moving. She listened to the long, unsteady exhale he let out sometime around midnight, the kind that animals make when the immediate terror recedes enough for exhaustion to settle in underneath it. She went inside and slept 4 hours. She was back at the fence at dawn. This was how it went for the first week. She did not attempt to touch him more than he allowed. She did not bring out a saddle or a bridle, or anything that looked like it might be asking something of him. She brought feed and water and her presence, and she offered all three at the same consistent time every morning and every evening, because consistency was the first language of trust with an animal that had been taught to expect unpredictability. By the end of the first week, he had stopped moving away when she entered the paddock. By the end of the second week, he had stopped flattening his ears. By the end of the third week, he was meeting her at the gate. She told no one about any of this because she had already learned that the people of Willow Creek were not interested in incremental progress. They were interested in either failure, which would confirm what they already believed, or a miracle, which they didn't actually think was coming. The quiet, patient truth of what was happening between her and Black Thunder did not fit into either story, so she kept it to herself and let the town keep its doubts. The doubts were plentiful. Caleb Turner made sure of that. Turner was the foreman at the Harrington Ranch, a man of 43, who had been working horses since he was 8 years old and wore his expertise the way some men wear fine coats, visibly intentionally, as a signal of status that he expected everyone around him to acknowledge. He was not a cruel man exactly. He was the particular kind of man who had been right about enough things over enough years that being wrong had become genuinely inconceivable to him, and who had therefore arranged his entire worldview around the project of never being wrong. He came by Sarah's farm on a Saturday morning in the third week uninvited, riding up the lane on a good quarter horse and stopping at the paddock fence to look at Black Thunder with the slow appraising stare of a man conducting an official assessment. "Still alive," he said by way of greeting. "Most mornings," Sarah said. She didn't look up from the fence post she was mending. "How's the horse?" "He's fine." "You ridden him yet?" "No." Turner leaned on his saddle horn. "You planning to?" "When he's ready." "And when's that gonna be?" Sarah set down her hammer. She turned and looked at Turner directly. "Mr. Turner, I appreciate you coming by, I do, but unless you've got something useful to offer, I'd be grateful if you'd let me get back to my work." Turner was quiet for a moment, which for him was unusual. Then he said, "You bought a horse nobody could train with money you couldn't afford to spend. I'm just trying to understand what your plan is." "My plan," Sarah said, "is to earn his trust." Turner made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "You earn trust from a person, Mrs. Whitmore. Horses, you break 'em. That's the way it's been done since before either of us was born." "That's the way it's been done wrong since before either of us was born," Sarah said pleasantly, and picked her hammer back up. Turner left without another word. He told the story at the Harrington bunkhouse that evening, and by Monday it had traveled to the barber shop, and by Wednesday it had been repeated with varying degrees of embellishment in the general store, the feed supply, and the back corner of the Willow Creek Savings and Loan, where a man named Richard Caldwell heard it, and became very interested indeed. Richard Caldwell was the kind of man who arrived in towns like Willow Creek from nowhere in particular, and made himself essential very quickly. He had money the provenance of which was vague, but the presence of which was impossible to ignore, and he had connections to cattle investors in Helena, and land speculators in Billings, and he wore his hat at an angle that communicated effortless confidence in a way that most men in the county genuinely could not pull off. He had been in Willow Creek for 8 months, long enough to have purchased a stake in 2 local operations and to have gotten himself onto the board of the savings and loan in a way that had seemed entirely natural at the time, and in retrospect, was difficult to explain. He was also, though this was known only to a very small number of people, deeply interested in a particular parcel of land 2 miles west of town. Sarah Whitmore's land. The specific appeal of the land had nothing to do with farming potential or grazing capacity. It had to do with water rights, a small but reliable spring that sat on the western edge of the property. The only reliable water source within 4 miles, the kind of thing that would make a very large cattle operation either possible or impossible, depending on who controlled it. Caldwell had plans. They were large plans, the kind that required specific parcels of land to be in specific hands at specific times. And Sarah Whitmore's stubbornness was inserting itself into those plans in a way that he found increasingly irritating. He had already approached her twice about selling. The first time she had been polite but firm. The second time she had been less polite. He had begun to understand that the direct approach was not going to work, and so he had shifted the way men of his particular type always eventually shift toward the indirect approach. The story of the widow and the impossible horse was, he recognized immediately, the beginning of an opportunity. He began carefully. He had a conversation with the bank manager about the status of Sarah's loan, not threatening, just inquiring in the collegial way of a board member who takes his fiduciary responsibilities seriously. He mentioned to Eleanor Marsh over the counter of the dry goods store that he'd heard the Whitmore woman was in difficult straits and that it worried him as a member of the community that she might be making decisions that weren't in her long-term interest. He said it with exactly the right amount of thoughtful concern, the kind that reads as charity to the person speaking it and as gossip to the person receiving it, and Eleanor Marsh received it as gossip and distributed it accordingly. The town began to watch Sarah more carefully. This was in its way another kind of pressure. But Sarah Whitmore had lived under pressure long enough to stop feeling it as anything other than weather. She was in the paddock with Black Thunder on the morning of the 4th week when he did the thing she had been waiting for. He had been standing at the far end of the enclosure, watching her, the way he always watched her, tracking every movement, every sound, every shift in her weight, with the particular vigilance of an animal that has learned the hard way that it cannot afford to be caught off guard. She was not looking at him directly. She had learned early that direct eye contact read to him as confrontation, so she had adopted the habit of keeping her gaze somewhere around his shoulder, present but not pressing the way you look at something you value without wanting to own it. She was just standing there. He walked toward her, not all the way. He stopped about 6 feet out, still more than she could easily touch, and he stood with his head lowered and his ears in the soft, neutral position that meant he was listening without alarm. His breath came and went slowly. The trembling that had been constant for the first 2 weeks was gone. He stayed there for maybe 4 minutes. Then he took one more step and lowered his head further, and his nose touched her open hand. Sarah did not move. She barely breathed. She let the contact happen on his terms. Let him feel the warmth of her palm, and decide for himself what it meant. And she waited while he processed the enormous and, for him, unprecedented fact of choosing to be close to a human being and not having anything terrible happen as a result. When he finally lifted his head and stepped back, she let him go. She did not tell herself this was victory. She knew better. This was one step in 100 steps, one small, fragile, reversible moment of something that might eventually become trust. But her heart was beating hard, and her eyes were burning in a way that had nothing to do with wind, because she knew what it had cost him to take that step, and she knew what it meant. She walked back to the house and stood at the kitchen window for a while. She thought about Daniel, the way she always thought about Daniel when something happened, that she wished she could tell someone, the quick flash of his face, the specific way his laugh had sounded, the empty chair at the kitchen table that she had never moved and was not going to move. She thought about how he would have looked at that horse. She thought about what he would have said. He would have said, "I knew you'd figure it out." She wiped her eyes and went back to work. The problem with a farm that is being held together by determination and minimal capital is that it requires constant intervention. The water pump had needed a new leather seal since September. The north fence line had 3 posts that were leaning at angles that suggested the ground underneath them had made a decision about where it preferred those posts to be. The barn roof had a section over the east stall that let in rain, which she had been managing with a succession of increasingly inadequate tarps, and which she was going to have to address properly before winter. She managed all of this alone because hiring help required money she did not have, and because asking for help from her neighbors had produced in her limited experience of attempting it a particular kind of sympathy that felt more like pity than assistance. The kind where people said, "You let me know if there's anything I can do," in a tone that made very clear they were not expecting you to take them up on it. 2 people were exceptions to this. The first was May Thorne, who was 61 years old and lived half a mile down the road and had survived a husband 2 hard winters, a fire that took her original house, and the general consensus of everyone around her that she was too old and too alone to be managing a property by herself. May had opinions about everything, and shared all of them freely, which Sarah found more comfortable than the careful managed conversations she had with most people in town. May brought food when she came to visit and did not ask permission to help with whatever needed doing while she was there, which Sarah had initially resisted and had gradually decided to be grateful for. The second was a boy named Eli Dawson, who was 14 and who had started appearing at the edge of Sarah's property on Saturday mornings around the time she began working with Black Thunder, initially just watching from a distance, and then as weeks passed gradually closer until he was at the paddock fence, and then without any formal conversation about it inside the fence with her, quiet and attentive and useful in the way that genuinely curious young people can be. Eli did not have a father. His mother worked at the hotel in town and worked long hours. He had a quality that Sarah recognized: a watchfulness, a containment, the particular self-sufficiency of a child who has learned not to need things from people who are not reliably available to provide them. He was good with the horse, not with the confidence of someone trained, but with the instinctive gentleness of someone who understood at a level below language that some creatures need to be approached as if you have all the time in the world, even when you don't. One Saturday morning he asked her, "Do you think he'll ever let you ride him?" "I think so," Sarah said. "What makes you sure?" She considered the question. "Because he's not mean," she said. "Mean you can't always fix. But afraid is something different. Afraid means there used to be a time before the fear. And if there was a time before, there can be a time after." Eli thought about this for a while. "What happened to him before?" he asked. "Before Harrington?" "I don't know yet," Sarah said. "But I intend to find out." It was a promise she had made to herself since the first day, and she had been making quiet inquiries, the kind that don't look like inquiries. Talking to the farrier who had worked on Black Thunder before Harrington bought him. Asking at the feed store about where the horse had come from, sending a letter to a woman she knew in Miles City whose husband dealt in horses and kept records. The answer she was beginning to understand involved a name she had not heard yet, but it was coming. Meanwhile, Caleb Turner was back. He came on a Tuesday evening this time, and he was not alone. He had with him 2 other men from the Harrington spread, and they had the loose, casual posture of people who have decided something, but have not said it out loud yet. "Mrs. Whitmore," Turner said, "we've been asked to pass something along." "By who?" "Mr. Caldwell. He wanted you to know he's increased his offer on the property, 20% above what he offered last month." Sarah kept her expression even. "Thank you for letting me know. He wanted me to mention that the offer won't stay open indefinitely. That's his business. He also wanted to say," Turner paused, choosing words carefully, "that he's concerned about your situation. The loan coming due in the spring. The state of the place. He's heard you've been spending your time on that horse instead of the land, and he's worried as a friend of the community that you might be—" "Mr. Turner," Sarah said. He stopped. "I know what Richard Caldwell is worried about," she said. "And it isn't me. You can tell him the land isn't for sale. Not at that price. Not at any price." She met Turner's eyes steadily. "And the horse is fine." Turner looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Black Thunder, who was standing at the far end of the paddock with his head raised, watching the three men with calm, unwavering attention. Something moved across Turner's face that was too complicated to name. He touched the brim of his hat. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and turned his horse and left. That night, Sarah sat at the kitchen table after dark with the lantern burning and Daniel's old map of the property spread out in front of her. She traced the property lines with her finger. She stopped at the spring on the western edge. She understood now completely what she was dealing with. She put the map away and went to bed. In the paddock outside, Black Thunder was quiet. She could hear him breathing slow, steady, the breathing of an animal that had for the first time in a long time decided it was safe enough to rest. She listened to it until she fell asleep. And in the morning she got up and went back to work. That was what you did when someone was trying to take everything from you. You got up, you went back to work. You gave nothing, not the land, not the horse, not one single inch of the life you were building without making them fight every step of the way for it. She was not afraid. She was tired, and she was lonely, and she was running on 4 hours of sleep and strong coffee and the specific stubbornness that comes from deciding once the kind of person you are going to be and refusing from that point forward to be any other kind. She was not afraid. Black Thunder was at the gate when she walked out. He bumped his head softly against her shoulder. Not a demand, not aggression, but the particular light contact of an animal that has decided you are safe to be near and wants you to know it. Sarah put her hand on his neck. "All right then," she said quietly. "All right." The morning after Turner's visit, Sarah woke before the sun and lay still in the dark for exactly 30 seconds, long enough to feel the weight of everything bearing down on her, and short enough that she didn't let it settle. Then she got up. She had learned this about herself in the months since Daniel died. 30 seconds was the safe limit. Past that, the thinking turned into something else, something that pulled at the floor beneath her and made standing up feel like a decision that required more justification than she had available. 30 seconds. Then feet on the floor. Then coffee on the stove. Then the next thing. The next thing that morning was the pump. The leather seal she had been patching since September had finally given out entirely overnight, and the water was coming up in thin, useless dribbles that were going to do nothing for a horse Black Thunder's size. She had a replacement seal she'd ordered from the hardware in town 2 weeks ago, and had been rationing the installation of the way you ration things when you know that fixing one problem is going to show you 2 more underneath it. She was right. The seal fit, but the rod below it had a hairline crack she hadn't seen before, and the crack was going to become a break inside of a month, and a new rod cost $4 she did not have. She sat back on her heels in the dirt beside the pump and held the cracked rod in her hands and breathed through her nose, slow and deliberate, until the number $4 stopped feeling like a wall and started feeling like a problem. Problems had solutions. Walls didn't. The difference was mostly in how you decided to look at it. She set the rod back and tightened everything as well as she could manage, and went to get Black Thunder's water from the creek by hand bucket by bucket, which took 40 minutes and left her arms shaking by the end. The horse watched her do it with his head over the paddock gate, tracking every trip with those wide, dark eyes that missed nothing. "I know," she said on the last trip. "It ain't elegant." He exhaled through his nose. She took it as agreement. She was back at the fence with his morning feed when she heard the wagon coming up the lane, and she turned, expecting May, which would have been early, but not impossible for May, who operated on her own schedule and had no patience for the conventional hours of either courtesy or commerce. It was not May. It was Eli Dawson on foot, and moving at a pace that told her something was wrong before he was close enough for her to read his face. He was 14, and he had the long legs of a boy who was going to be tall, and he was using all of them at the moment in a kind of controlled run that boys do when they want to seem like they're not running. He stopped at the fence. His breathing was fast. His best. "There's a man in town," he said. "At the Savings and Loan. I heard him talking to Mr. Caldwell outside before the doors opened this morning." He paused, pulling in a breath. "He said your loan payment, the one due in the spring. He said Caldwell's been talking to the bank about calling it early." Sarah went very still. "Early," she repeated. Before spring? Maybe February. Eli met her eyes. He was not a boy who dramatized things, which was one of the reasons she trusted him. I don't know if it's true. I thought you should know what I heard. Sarah looked at him for a moment. Then she said, Thank you, Eli. I mean that. He nodded, then looked past her at Black Thunder, who had come to the fence and was standing with his head stretched out in Eli's direction, not with alarm, but with the kind of relaxed curiosity he'd been showing more of lately. The curiosity that meant the fear had receded enough to let the actual horse underneath it start to come through. He looks different, Eli said quietly. He is different, Sarah said. A little more every day. Eli watched the horse for a moment. Then he said, What are you going to do about the loan? I'm going to go to the bank, Sarah said. Today. She left Eli with instructions to make sure Black Thunder had water and walked into Willow Creek with the deed to her property and Daniel's original loan papers in a leather folder under her arm and her chin up and her jaw set, in the particular way that people in Willow Creek had started to recognize as meaning that Sarah Whitmore had made a decision and was in the process of enacting it and was not interested in discussion. The savings and loan was a narrow building on the main street with a glass door and a wooden counter and a smell of paper and ink that always made Sarah feel like she was about to be evaluated. The bank manager was a man named Gerald Prentice, who had small eyes and large hands, and who had been managing the Willow Creek savings and loan for 11 years in a way that was scrupulously neutral in most things and had recently, Sarah understood, become somewhat less neutral in the matter of her loan. She placed the folder on the counter and waited while he opened it and looked at the papers with the expression of a man examining something that makes him mildly uncomfortable. Mrs. Whitmore, he said finally. Mr. Prentice, she said. I've heard some talk about my loan being called before the scheduled date. I'd like to understand whether that's true, and if so, on what basis. Prentice folded his hands. Now nobody has made any official. Is it true? He was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that is actually a yes dressed up as consideration. The board has had some discussions, he said, about the overall health of certain accounts. Given the changes in your situation since Mr. Whitmore's passing, there are concerns about your capacity to. My payments are current, Sarah said. Every one of them, on time, without exception. That's correct, yes. Then on what basis is there any discussion about calling this loan early? Prentice looked at his hands. The collateral value of the property has been reassessed. There's a question of whether the current operation can generate sufficient. Who requested the reassessment? A longer silence. Mr. Prentice. Her voice was quiet and absolutely level. Who requested the reassessment? He looked up at her then, and what she saw in his face was not cruelty. It was something worse, something more ordinary. It was discomfort. He was a man who was uncomfortable with what was happening and had decided that being uncomfortable was the same as being blameless. There was a request from a board member, he said. I'm not in a position to say who specifically made. Was it Richard Caldwell? The silence that followed was its own answer. Sarah picked up her folder. She squared the papers inside it with 2 precise movements and tucked it back under her arm. I want it noted in writing, she said, that my payments are current, that my collateral has not materially changed, and that I am contesting any early call on this loan as improper and retaliatory. She held Prentice's gaze. And I would suggest, Mr. Prentice, that you think carefully about whose interests you are serving with these discussions, because I intend to find out what my rights are, and then I intend to exercise them. She left the bank. Outside on the street, she stood in the cold air for a moment and breathed. She was not going to let herself shake until she was somewhere private. She had learned this too, that composure in public was not the same as pretending nothing was wrong. It was a tool. It was the thing you used when the people around you were watching for a crack to push through. She heard the door of the bank open behind her. She turned, expecting Prentice. It was not Prentice. It was a man she did not recognize, older than her by 20 years maybe, with weathered hands and a face that had been outdoors for most of its life, and a posture that was somewhere between hesitation and decision, like a man who has talked himself into something and is now in the process of talking himself back out of it. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't read. Then he said, "You're the woman who bought Black Thunder." It wasn't quite a question. "I am," Sarah said. He looked at her for another moment. "I need to talk to you," he said. "Not here, not in town." He glanced back toward the door of the bank, then up the street toward the general store, with the particular wariness of a man who is conscious of being seen. "I know things about that horse. Things you ought to know. Things I should have said a long time ago." Sarah studied him. "Who are you?" she asked. "My name is Thomas Reed," he said. "I was his trainer, before Harrington, before any of this." She looked at him for 3 full seconds. Then she said, "Come to my farm, this afternoon." He came. He arrived on a gray gelding around 2 o'clock, and he tied the horse at the fence post near the barn and stood looking at Black Thunder in the paddock for a long time before he said anything. The stallion was at the center of the enclosure, head up, watching Reed with an attention that was different from the way he watched most people, not fear exactly, but something older and more specific than fear. Recognition, maybe. The residue of memory. Reed saw it. His jaw tightened. He looked away. "How long have you had him?" he asked. 5 weeks, Sarah said. "He let you near him. Yesterday he came to the gate on his own." Reed was quiet for a moment. 5 weeks, he said in a tone that wasn't quite directed at her. More like a man recalculating something he thought he understood. They went inside, and Sarah put coffee on because that was what you did, and because she needed something to do with her hands, while he figured out how to say what he'd come to say. He sat at her kitchen table with his hat in his hands and told her. Black Thunder, whose original name had been Midnight Star, which Sarah filed away with the particular ache of a fact that arrives too late to have been useful, had been foaled on a breeding farm outside of Miles City 6 years earlier. He had been by every account a remarkable young horse. Strong, intelligent, fast, in the specific way that the best horses are, fast, not just with their legs, but with their minds, reading the ground in front of them, and making decisions before a rider could give instruction. A horse that seemed to want to run, which was different from a horse that could be made to run, and the difference was everything. He had been purchased at the age of 2 by a man named Frank Dalton. Reed said the name the way people say the names of storms that have already passed with a residual tension in the body, as if some part of the brain was still deciding whether they were really over. Dalton was a gambler and a speculator who had made money in cattle and lost it in cards and made it again in ways that didn't benefit from being examined closely. He had decided with the certainty of a man who did not know enough about horses to know what he didn't know, that Black Thunder was going to be a racing horse, and that the racing horse was going to make him money. He hired Reed to train him. "I knew in the first month," Reed said, turning his coffee cup in his hands without drinking it, that Dalton didn't understand what he had. Midnight Star wasn't a racing horse. He wasn't built for it. His stride was too long for short distances. His temperament was too smart for it. Smart horses don't race well. They think too much. The best racing horses are the ones that don't question the track, they just run it. Reed stopped, looked at the table. He needed a different kind of work. Cattle, maybe. Or distance riding. Something that used his mind and his strength together. I told Dalton that. 3 times I told him. "What did Dalton say?" Sarah asked. "He said I didn't know what I was talking about. He said he'd paid good money for a racing horse, and a racing horse was what he was going to get." Reed looked up at her. "And then he started doing the training himself. At night, mostly, when I wasn't there." Sarah's hands tightened around her coffee cup. "He used a whip," Reed said. "It came out flat and factual, the way people state things they have had a long time to regret. And when the whip didn't work, he used a length of chain. And when the horse fought back because he fought back, he always fought back. He was not a horse that would just, when he fought back, Dalton punished him harder." He stopped again. "I came in one morning and found Midnight Star in a state that I had been working horses for 20 years, and I had never seen an animal that frightened. He was beyond scared. He was—" Reed's voice changed registers slightly, pulling back from something. He was somewhere else. Somewhere inside himself where nothing could reach him. "But you stayed," Sarah said quietly, not accusatory. Asking. Reed held her gaze. "I stayed 1 more week," he said. "And then I quit. And I didn't report it. I didn't tell anyone. I told myself there was nothing I could do, that Dalton had legal ownership, that the law wasn't going to—" He stopped. "Those were the reasons I gave myself. I don't know how much of them were true." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, Sarah could hear Black Thunder moving in the paddock, the sound of his hooves on the dry ground unhurried. "What happened after that?" she asked. Dalton sold him, 6 months later. He never raced, he was unmanageable by then, and Dalton had no patience for anything he couldn't control quickly. He went through 3 owners in 2 years before Harrington got him. Each one tried the same thing, forced dominance punishment. Each one made it worse. Reed looked at his hands. "And then you bought him for $1. The word sat there between them for a moment. "There's something else," Reed said. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and drew out a folded paper worn at the creases like it had been handled many times. He placed it on the table between them. "I kept records from when I was training him, including records of what Dalton did, what I saw." He paused. "I also kept records of some other things, about Dalton's business dealings. He had a partner for a while, a man he was working some land schemes with. Someone who put money into a couple of Dalton's operations and walked away clean when they fell through, leaving other people holding the debt." "Idea." Sarah looked at the paper, then at Reed. "Richard Caldwell?" she said. Reed didn't look surprised that she knew the name. He was careful. "His name isn't in anything official, but I was there. I saw the meetings. I know what I know." Sarah unfolded the paper slowly. It was a ledger page dense with figures and dates and initials, the kind of document that is meaningless without context and devastating with it. Her eyes moved across it carefully. "Why are you bringing this to me now?" she asked. Reed was quiet for a long moment. "Because I drove past your farm last week," he said. "And I saw you in that paddock. And I saw him let you touch him." His voice was rough now, rougher than it had been, and Sarah understood that the roughness was its own kind of admission. "And I thought if I'd done what I should have done 6 years ago, maybe he never would have needed saving. Maybe you never would have had to spend your last dollar on something the whole county was calling worthless." He looked at her directly. "I can't fix what I didn't do then, but I can tell you what I know now, if it helps." Sarah looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "It helps." She kept the paper. What followed in the next 10 days was the quietest war she had ever fought and the most complicated. She wrote 2 letters, one to a lawyer in Helena, whose name Daniel had trusted, explaining the situation, with the loan laying out the timeline of Caldwell's involvement on the bank board, and asking what her legal options were, and a second letter to the county land office requesting documentation of all property transactions involving Richard Caldwell in the past 7 years, which she was legally entitled to request, and which she suspected Caldwell had not anticipated her being aware enough to do. She received the lawyer's reply on a Thursday morning. His name was Henry Alcott, and his letter was precise and careful, and gave her, for the first time since she had walked into the Willow Creek Savings and Loan, the specific sensation of solid ground beneath her feet. The loan call he wrote was almost certainly improper, given her payment history, and there was a process for contesting it. The process would take time and would require documentation. He asked her to send everything she had. She sent everything she had. While she waited, she worked. She fixed the north fence posts herself, digging out the failing ones with a bar, and setting new posts with the correct depth, which took 3 days, and left her hands blistered in ways that took another week to stop being painful. She patched the barn roof properly, not with tarps. She ordered the replacement pump rod from the hardware store and negotiated a 2-month payment arrangement with the owner, who was a man named Horatio Burns, 70 years old, who had been in Willow Creek since before it was properly a town, and who had no interest in Caldwell's opinions about anything. And every morning and every evening she was in the paddock. Black Thunder was changing. She could see it happening. The way you see seasons change not in a single moment, but in the accumulation of days, each one slightly different from the one before it. Until one morning, you realize the temperature is different, and the light is different, and the world has quietly become something other than what it was. He was beginning to follow her around the paddock, not at her heels, not with the anxious pressing of an insecure horse, but with the relaxed, interested trailing of an animal that has decided your company is worth having. When she stopped, he stopped. When she moved, he moved. When she stood still with her back to him, deliberately not engaging, giving him the space to choose, he would eventually walk up behind her and breathe warm air against her shoulder. Eli watched all of this with the focused attention of someone taking notes. "You never use treats," he said one afternoon. It was an observation, not a complaint. "Not yet," Sarah said. "Treats make them come to you for the treat. I want him to come because he wants to be here." Eli turned this over. "What's the difference?" "The difference is what happens when you don't have a treat." He thought about it, then nodded. May Thorne came by on a Saturday with a pot of stew, and the information delivered in May's characteristic style, blunt, rapid, without preamble, that Richard Caldwell had been seen dining with a county land surveyor at the hotel 3 nights in a row. "Surveyor," Sarah repeated. "Amos Pike. Comes out from Helena twice a year. Not cheap to hire." May set the pot on Sarah's stove and began moving things around to make room for it in the efficient proprietorial way she had in other people's kitchens. "He's measuring something. People saw him out past your western fence line on Wednesday." Sarah's eyes went to the window in the direction of the spring she couldn't see from the house. "How long has Pike been here?" she asked. "Got in Monday." May turned to look at her. "Caldwell ain't waiting, Sarah. Whatever he's planning, he's moving it along." "So am I," Sarah said. That night she sat at Daniel's desk with Reed's ledger page and the documents from the county land office and Henry Alcott's letter, and she laid them out in front of her and looked at them for a long time, building in her mind the architecture of what she was going to do, placing each piece in the order that would make sense to a judge, to a jury, to a room full of people who had spent the last 3 months expecting her to fail. She was not going to fail, but she was going to need something else. Something that could not be contained in a ledger page or a lawyer's letter. Something that could stand in front of this town and say without equivocation that she was who she said she was and that Black Thunder was what she said he was. She needed the horse to be ready. She went out to the paddock in the dark and stood at the gate. Black Thunder came to her immediately now, no hesitation, no circling. He put his head over the gate, and she put her hand against his neck and felt the warmth of him through the cold air. "We're going to need to go a little faster," she told him. He pressed his head gently against her shoulder. She began working with the saddle the next morning. Not putting it on, just showing it to him, letting him smell it, letting him learn that it was an object and not a threat, that it had a particular smell and a particular weight, and that none of those things meant anything was going to happen to him. This stage took 4 days. He snorted at it. The first day moved away from it on the second, tolerated it on the third, and on the fourth morning pressed his nose to the leather with the frank investigative curiosity that was becoming. She was realizing one of his most characteristic expressions, that quality of a genuinely intelligent animal deciding to understand something rather than simply fear it. On the 5th day she rested the saddle pad on his back for 30 seconds. He held still. She took it off. She waited. She put it back. He held still. She took it off again, gave him 10 minutes to process, then put the saddle on slowly with the patience of someone who understands that the goal is not today's success, but the foundation of every day after. She didn't cinch it. She just let him feel the weight, let him walk with it, let him understand it was possible to carry it and still be himself. By the end of the 2nd week of saddle work, she had him cinched and walking calmly in the paddock. Eli, watching from the fence, said nothing for a long time. Then he said very quietly, "Mrs. Whitmore, that horse was supposed to be impossible." "That horse," Sarah said, watching Black Thunder move, "was never impossible. He was just waiting for someone who was going to take the time to figure him out. Turner drove by one afternoon and stopped at the road and watched for a full 5 minutes without getting off his horse. Sarah saw him from the corner of her eye and did not acknowledge him. He rode away without speaking. He came back 2 days later and got off his horse. He stood at the paddock fence for a while. Then he said, "I want to apologize." Sarah turned to look at him. "I was wrong about the horse," Turner said. He held himself with the rigid discomfort of a man delivering news that is costing him something. "I was wrong about what he needed, and I was—" He stopped, started again. "I was wrong about you." Sarah watched him. "I've been saying things in town," he said. "About you not being able to manage the place, about the horse being more trouble than he was worth, about Caldwell's offer being—" He stopped again. His jaw worked. "I didn't know what I was looking at," he said. "I know that ain't much of an excuse." "It ain't," Sarah said. "But it's something." Turner looked at the horse. He looked at Sarah. He looked like a man in the process of becoming something he hadn't expected to be. "Is there anything I can do?" he asked. Sarah regarded him for a long moment. "Yes," she said. "There is." She told him what she needed. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he nodded once, the sharp, definitive nod of a man who has found his way back to something he recognized as right. "I'll be there," he said. The court hearing was set for the 3rd week of November. Caldwell had filed his claim through a county court mechanism that Sarah's lawyer had described in the careful language of the law as procedurally creative, which meant Sarah understood that it was technically legal in its construction and deeply improper in its intent. Caldwell had used the savings and loans assessed value of her property, the condition of the farm as documented in a report commissioned by the board, which report Sarah's lawyer had already identified 3 specific inaccuracies in and a secondary claim about the danger posed by black thunder to neighboring properties, which was the piece that made her jaw tighten hardest. Because that was the piece that was about more than the land. That was the piece that was about the horse. And the horse was not dangerous. She knew it. Eli knew it. May knew it. Turner was beginning to know it. The town needed to know it. She had 3 weeks. She went back to the paddock. Black Thunder was standing in the last of the afternoon light, relaxed and quiet, and watching her come with those dark, enormous eyes that had seen too much and were slowly beginning to let it go. She picked up the reins. She put her foot in the stirrup. She paused. He stood perfectly still. She swung up. For one suspended second, there was nothing. No movement, no sound, nothing but the solidity of the saddle beneath her, and the warmth of the horse under that, and the complete absolute stillness of an animal choosing in this moment not to be afraid. Then he walked forward, 1 step, 2, 3, even, calm, deliberate. Sarah let out a breath she felt like she'd been holding since March. They walked the full perimeter of the paddock once slowly, and she asked for nothing more than that. When she dismounted, she pressed her forehead against his neck and stayed there for a moment. "Good boy," she said softly. "Good boy." Outside the fence, Eli was standing with both hands gripping the top rail, and tears running openly down his face, which he was not bothering to hide. "Don't say a word," Sarah said without turning around. "I'm not saying anything," Eli said in the strangled voice of someone saying a great deal without words. She laughed. It came out full and unexpected and real, the kind of laugh that surfaces from somewhere you'd forgotten was there. 3 weeks until the hearing. She had a horse. She had a lawyer. She had the truth on paper and a man named Turner willing to speak it aloud. Now she needed to show this town who they were really looking at. 3 weeks felt like 3 days. Sarah had known in the abstract that time moved differently when something large was coming toward you. She had felt it in the weeks before Daniel's funeral, in the months before the first loan payment came due, in the long, strange compression of grief that made some hours stretch into days and some entire weeks vanish without leaving any impression at all. But this was different. This was time moving fast, because she was filling every hour of it with something that mattered, and there was a particular quality to that kind of fast. Not the panicked, slipping speed of a situation getting away from you, but the focused, purposeful speed of a person who knows exactly what she is doing and is doing all of it at once, She rode Black Thunder every morning, not long sessions, not demanding ones. She was not trying to build a performance horse in 3 weeks. She was trying to show this town the truth of what this animal was. And the truth was not in acrobatics or speed or tricks. The truth was in the quality of his attention, in the way he moved when he was not afraid, in the steadiness of an animal who had every reason to have given up on human beings, and had chosen against all the evidence of his experience to trust one instead. She kept the sessions short and ended them while he was still willing, because that was the rule. You always stopped before the animal had to tell you to stop, because the animal telling you to stop was a step backward, and she didn't have steps to spare. On the mornings, she wasn't riding, she was writing. Henry Alcott, the lawyer in Helena, had sent back a second letter with specific questions and a list of documents he needed organized and referenced. Sarah worked through the list methodically every evening after dark at Daniel's desk, with the lantern turned up high, and Reed's ledger page and the county land office records and the bank's own assessment documents spread around her in a semicircle, building the kind of paper argument that said, without drama and without appeal to emotion, that Richard Caldwell had been systematically working to acquire her property through improper means for the better part of a year, and that the mechanisms he had used, the board seat at the savings and loan, the commissioned assessment, with its convenient inaccuracies, the legal claim filed through a county mechanism usually reserved for abandoned or genuinely dangerous properties, were not the actions of a concerned community member, but of a man with a plan. She sent the documents on a Monday. On Tuesday, Caldwell's man came back. It was not Turner this time. Turner had not come back to Caldwell's side, a fact that Sarah suspected Caldwell had not yet fully processed and was going to find extremely inconvenient when he did. The man Caldwell sent was younger, broad through the chest, with the particular blank confidence of someone who has been given a message to deliver and has not been told what to do if the person doesn't receive it the way they're supposed to. He stopped his horse at Sarah's gate and said without getting down, "Mr. Caldwell wanted me to let you know the offer stands. Whatever lawyer you've got working on the other thing, he said the offer still stands. More than fair market value. Clean transaction. Everybody walks away without trouble." Sarah was at the fence with a post driver in her hands. She set it down. "Tell Mr. Caldwell," she said, "that I'm not interested in a clean transaction. I'm interested in my land and my rights and the truth about how he's been operating in this county. And I'm going to the hearing, and I'm going to say so in front of a judge." She picked the post driver back up. "He can come himself next time if he wants to have this conversation. I'm done having it through intermediaries." The man blinked. He had clearly not been given instructions for this response. He left. That night someone cut Sarah's fence. She found it the next morning, a clean cut, not a break in the section of the north fence line she had just replaced. Deliberate. Efficient. The kind of thing done by someone who knew what they were doing and wanted it to look like a message without looking like evidence. Black Thunder was still in the paddock, which meant either he hadn't found it or he had found it, and chosen not to go through, which she chose to believe, because it was true to who he was becoming, even if she couldn't prove it. She repaired the fence before breakfast. She didn't tell anyone except May. May's response was to arrive 2 hours later with her old shotgun under her arm and an expression that suggested she was hoping someone would give her a reason to use it. "May," Sarah said. "I'm staying a few days," May said in the tone that was not a request. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to. I'm doing it anyway." May leaned the shotgun against the barn wall with the comfort of long familiarity. "Now show me what you need done." 2 days before the hearing, Thomas Reed came back. He arrived in the late afternoon, looking like a man who hadn't slept well and had been arguing with himself about something the entire time he wasn't sleeping. He tied his horse at the fence post, the same post as before, and came to find Sarah in the paddock, where she was doing a final light session with Black Thunder, just walking, just the two of them moving together in the familiar easy rhythm they'd built over weeks. Reed watched for a moment. The look on his face was complicated in the way that looks are complicated when they contain regret, and something that is trying to become something better than regret. "I've been thinking," he said when she brought Black Thunder to a stop near the fence. "About what?" "About testifying." He said the word like he'd been turning it in his mouth for a while and hadn't fully decided whether to swallow it. At the hearing, about what I saw with Dalton, about what I know about Caldwell. He looked at the horse, then back at her. I didn't do right by him the first time. I'd like to do right by him now if you'll let me. Sarah looked at him for a long moment. Henry Alcott will want to talk to you first, she said. He'll need a statement. Everything you told me in writing with dates. I know. It's going to make Caldwell aware that you're involved. He's not going to like it. I know that too. Are you sure? Reed met her eyes, and she saw in them the particular steadiness of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has finally decided to put it down in the right place. I'm sure, he said. She sent a letter to Alcott that evening with Reed's name and the information that he was prepared to testify. Alcott's reply came back in 36 hours, faster than any previous letter, which told her that the lawyer had been waiting for exactly this. The night before the hearing, Sarah could not sleep. She lay in the dark and listened to the sounds of the house. May's breathing from the other room. The occasional movement of black thunder in the paddock. The particular settling sounds of a structure that had been standing long enough to have its own language. She was not afraid, she decided. Or if she was afraid, it was the clean kind, the kind that tells you something matters not, the kind that tells you something is impossible. She thought about Daniel. She thought about the loan papers he'd signed with the particular care of a man who believed he was building something that would last. She thought about the spring on the western edge of the property, the one she'd grown up thinking of as just a place to water the stock and fill buckets, the one that turned out to be the real reason this fight was happening. She thought about Caldwell and the way his whole architecture of acquisition depended on her not knowing what she was dealing with, not being brave enough or smart enough or stubborn enough to push back. She thought about Black Thunder standing in the dark outside, quiet and steady. Nothing like the animal who had exploded with terror in Harrington's pen 2 months ago. She got up at 4 a.m. and went out to the paddock. He was at the gate already, like he'd been waiting. She stood with him for a long time in the cold, her hand on his neck, not talking. Sometimes the most important conversations are the ones that don't need words. The Willow Creek County hearing room was a long, low-ceilinged space that smelled of wood and old paper and the specific dry warmth of a wood stove working hard against the November cold. It held maybe 50 people comfortably and was holding considerably more than that when Sarah walked in on the morning of the hearing. She had worn her best dress, navy blue collar pressed, the one she'd bought the spring before Daniel died, and had worn 3 times since, and she had done her hair with more care than usual, not because she cared what anyone thought of her appearance, but because she understood that appearance communicated something in rooms like this, and she wanted what it communicated to be. I am not desperate. I am not overwhelmed. I am exactly where I intend to be. She saw Caldwell immediately. He was seated at a table near the front, with 2 men she didn't recognize, one of whom had the confident, expensive stillness of someone's lawyer from Helena. He was dressed well. He looked like the kind of man who won things. He looked across the room at her with an expression that was almost perfectly neutral, almost. Not quite. There was something in his eyes that she had not expected. Not smugness, she had expected smugness. It was something more careful than that, something closer to watchfulness, which meant she understood that he knew about Reed. She sat down at the table on her side and placed her leather folder in front of her. Henry Alcott, small, precise 50-ish, with the energized quiet of a man who is very good at what he does, and knows it, sat beside her, and opened his own considerably larger folder without preamble or greeting, because they had already said everything that needed saying in their correspondence, and now they were past words and into the thing itself. The hearing was called to order by Judge Walter Crane, who was 64 years old, who had been circuit judge in this county for 19 years, and who had the particular kind of patience that comes from spending 2 decades listening to people argue about property and money and livestock, and finding in almost all cases that the truth was simpler than everyone was making it. Caldwell's lawyer spoke first. His name was Monroe, and he was good fluid and organized, presenting the claim with the convincing architecture of a man who had built a solid case from real materials. The bank assessment, the loan status, the property condition report, the documented incidents of Black Thunder's violent behavior at the Harrington Ranch, the neighbor complaints, the public safety concern. It took him 40 minutes, and it was impressive. And Sarah watched it happen the way you watch a building being constructed when you know something the builders don't know about the ground it's sitting on. Alcott's presentation was shorter and faster and more devastating. He began with the bank. He laid out document by document the timeline of Richard Caldwell's activity on the board of the Willow Creek Savings and Loan as it corresponded precisely to the timeline of his interest in Sarah's property. The reassessment requested, the month after his second offer was refused. The questions raised about loan status, the conversations with Prentice that Prentice, when deposed in writing, had described with the guilty precision of a man who has been told his candor now is in his interest. Alcott laid the documents on the judge's table in order. He did not editorialize. He did not need to. The date spoke. Then he called Thomas Reed. Reed came forward from the back of the room, and something shifted in the crowd, a murmur, a movement. The collective adjustment of 50 people recalibrating what they were watching. He told his story plainly. He told it the way he had told it to Sarah, in her kitchen, flatly, factually, without excuse or dramatic embellishment, because it was bad enough without either. He described what Dalton had done to the horse. He described what he had and had not done at the time. He described the relationship between Dalton and Caldwell, the investment stake, the deals that had fallen through and left other people in debt, while Caldwell walked away clean. When Monroe rose to question him, he found a man who had already decided he was going to tell the truth, regardless of where it landed, and there is very little you can do to a witness in that condition. Monroe tried 3 different angles and found all of them leading back to the same place. And finally he sat down. The crowd was very quiet. Judge Crane looked at the documents. He looked at Reed. He looked at Caldwell. And then Alcott called Caleb Turner. Turner walked to the front of the room with the posture of a man who has made a decision and is carrying it correctly. He looked at Caldwell on his way to the stand, and he didn't look away until he was past him. He told the court what he had seen at Sarah's farm over the past weeks. He described it with the authority of someone who had spent 20 years working horses, what it meant that the horse came to the gate, what it meant that he accepted a rider, what the behavioral markers of a genuinely dangerous horse looked like, and how none of them were present in Black Thunder under Sarah's management. He said it plainly and technically, and with the weight of expertise behind it. And when he finished, he added one thing that was not technical at all. "I mocked that woman in front of the whole county," he said. "I told people she didn't know what she was doing. I was wrong. She did what none of us could do, and she did it the right way. That horse ain't a public safety threat. He's one of the finest animals in this county, and she's the reason why." Silence. Caldwell's jaw was very tight. Monroe leaned over and said something to him in a low voice. Caldwell shook his head once sharply, but what came next was not on anyone's schedule. It was Eleanor Marsh. Eleanor Marsh, who ran the dry goods store, who had said, "Lord have mercy." That's the Whitmore widow, who had been the first voice raised against Sarah the day she bought Black Thunder, who had distributed Caldwell's concerns about Sarah's capabilities with the efficiency of a woman who moved through a community's information channels like water through good soil. Eleanor Marsh stood up from her seat in the middle of the gallery without being called, without asking permission, and said in a voice that carried to every corner of the room, "Judge Crane, I'd like to say something." The room went entirely silent. Crane looked at her. "This is a legal proceeding, Mrs. Marsh. I understand that. I'm not a witness. I'm a member of this community, and I'd like 2 minutes." Crane considered her for a moment. He was as noted a patient man. 2 minutes, he said. Eleanor Marsh stood with her hands folded at her waist, and she said, "I have known Richard Caldwell for 8 months. In those 8 months, I've heard him speak his concerns about Sarah Whitmore's situation no fewer than 12 times in my store, and on the street, and at the church social, and at the 4th of July, and at other occasions that I will not enumerate because I only have 2 minutes. I thought his concern was genuine, because men in his position generally have genuine concern for things that benefit them. And Richard Caldwell's concern for Sarah Whitmore's situation benefited him considerably. She paused. I repeated what he said. To a lot of people. I helped this town believe that a woman who was fighting to survive was actually just failing because it was easier to believe the man with money than the widow with a dollar horse. She looked at Sarah across the room. I'm sorry for that. And I think this court should know that whatever else it decides today, the reputation of Sarah Whitmore in this community has been shaped by a man with an interest in damaging it, and that the court should take that into account. She sat down. The room broke. Not into chaos, into the particular noise of 50 people processing something simultaneously, a collective recalibration that manifested as whispers and shifted positions, and the long collective exhale of a crowd that has been watching something and has just figured out what it was. Caldwell sat very still in the noise. Monroe was writing something rapidly on his notepad. Sarah sat at her table and kept her face composed because she was not going to cry in this room. Not today. Not in front of Richard Caldwell. Her hands under the table were shaking slightly. She pressed them flat against her thighs and breathed. Judge Crane let the noise run for 30 seconds, then brought his gavel down once with the weight of a man who does not need to use it twice. The room went quiet. He looked down at the documents in front of him. He spent a long time with them, long enough that the room held its breath, long enough that Monroe shifted in his seat, and Caldwell's stillness became the rigid stillness of a man exerting control, long enough that Sarah became aware of her own heartbeat as a specific physical sensation. Then the judge looked up. I have a question for Mr. Caldwell, he said. Caldwell straightened. Monroe put a hand on his arm briefly. Mr. Caldwell, Crane said, can you explain to this court the nature of your financial relationship with Mr. Frank Dalton between the years 1877 and 1879? The room did not make a sound. Caldwell's face did something complicated. It was only a second, and he controlled it quickly, but a second was enough, and the room was full of people who had been watching his face for various lengths of time, and all of them saw it. I'd need to consult with my attorney before, Caldwell began. Of course, Crane said pleasantly. Take your time. Monroe leaned in. The consultation took about 90 seconds, conducted in the barely audible murmur of two men recalculating in real time. The room waited. Then Monroe straightened and said, Your Honor, my client is prepared to provide documentation regarding any business relationships germane to this proceeding, but we'd respectfully request a brief recess to gather the relevant documentation, Alcott said from his table without looking up from his papers, is in the materials already submitted to the court, pages 11 through 14. Crane turned to pages 11 through 14. He read them. The entire room waited, and in that waiting was something that Sarah recognized, but had not felt in a long time, the specific quality of a thing about to become something else, the moment just before balance tips. When everyone can feel which way it's going to go, but the going hasn't happened yet. Crane set the pages down. He looked at Caldwell. And Caldwell, who had spent 8 months being the most certain man in every room he entered, looked down at the table. That was when Sarah knew. She knew before the judge said a word. She knew in the same way she had known weeks ago that Black Thunder was not a dangerous horse, but a terrified one, not from a single sign, but from the accumulation of everything, from the whole picture resolving at once into something that could not be mistaken for anything else. Crane spoke for 12 minutes. He addressed the impropriety of the loan reassessment, citing the specific procedural requirements that Caldwell's request had failed to meet, and noting that the timing of the request as documented in the materials was sufficient to establish its retaliatory character. He addressed the property condition report, identifying the 3 inaccuracies Alcott had flagged and ruling the document inadmissible as evidence. He addressed the public safety claim regarding Black Thunder, citing Turner's testimony as expert evidence and ruling the claim unsupported by sufficient evidence to justify the relief requested. And then he said, "It is the finding of this court that the application to transfer ownership of the Whitmore property is denied. The property shall remain in the ownership of Mrs. Sarah Whitmore, free from any encumbrance arising from this proceeding. The Willow Creek Savings and Loan is hereby directed to honor the existing terms of the Whitmore loan without modification. This court further recommends that the conduct of board member Richard Caldwell in relation to the loan reassessment be reviewed by the bank's governing authority. He set down his papers. Court is adjourned, he said. The sound that went through the room was not applause. It was something more complex than applause. It was 50 people's worth of unresolved feeling, releasing at once, some of it relief, some of it satisfaction, some of it the particular uncomfortable feeling of a community reckoning with the part it played in allowing a wrong to happen. There was clapping in there from a few people. There was the scrape of chairs. There was conversation starting up simultaneously from multiple directions. Sarah sat still. Alcott was already gathering his documents, folding them with the efficient satisfaction of a man who has done exactly what he set out to do. He leaned over and said quietly, "Well done," which coming from him was the equivalent of a speech. "You did most of it," Sarah said. "You built the case," he said. "I just carried it into the room." She looked across at Caldwell's table. He was standing his back already partially to the room, speaking to Monroe in a low, rapid voice, with the posture of a man reorganizing his plans, rather than accepting defeat, which told her with clear-eyed realism that this was not the last she would hear from him. A man who had built what he built did not simply dissolve when a judge ruled against him. He retreated. He recalculated. He found other angles. She would deal with that when it came. Today she had won. May found her in the crowd before she'd made it to the door. May put both hands on her face, this surprising fierce gesture, and looked at her for a moment without speaking. Then she said, "Daniel would be so proud of you." Sarah's composure held for exactly one more second. Then it didn't. May held her right there in the middle of the hearing room with people moving around them and Caldwell leaving through the side door, and Eleanor Marsh watching from across the room with an expression of something that might eventually become grace, and Sarah let herself have 30 seconds. The same 30 seconds she allowed herself every morning, the measured, honest 30 seconds of actually feeling what she felt. Then she pulled back and wiped her face and straightened her collar. Turner was waiting near the door. He looked at her as she approached with the expression of a man who has done something he can't take back and is not sure yet whether that's frightening or right. It turned out to be both. "Thank you," Sarah said. He nodded. Stiff. Real. It needed to be said. It did. He started to turn, then stopped. "For what it's worth, what you did with that horse. That's the most remarkable piece of horsemanship I've seen in 20 years. And I've seen a lot." Sarah looked at him. "It wasn't horsemanship," she said. "It was listening." Turner held her gaze for a moment. Then something moved in his face, not quite a smile, but its direction. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and stepped aside to let her through. Outside, the cold air was sharp and immediate and real. Eli was waiting on the steps. He had not been allowed inside, being 14, and not a legal party. But he had been on those steps for 2 hours, and he had the face of someone who has been very afraid for a long time and is just now getting the news. He read her face. His whole body changed this sudden, involuntary release, like a breath held too long. "You won," he said. "We won," she said. He looked past her at the sky the way young people do when an emotion is too large for their face, and they need to put it somewhere. "What do we do now?" he asked. Sarah looked toward the edge of town in the direction of the farm where Black Thunder was standing in his paddock in the cold November air, waiting for her to come home. "Now," she said, "we go back to work." She meant it. But she also meant something else, something she didn't say out loud, because she was still building the language for it. The understanding that winning in a courtroom was the beginning of something, not the end of it. That the real work, the daily patient, unglamorous necessary work of building a life that could hold the weight of everything she wanted it to hold, was what came after. The land was hers. The horse was hers. The debt was still real. The pump rod was still cracked. The north fence line would need attention again in spring, and she had a horse that the entire county was now looking at differently. a horse that nobody had believed in. A horse that had walked calmly and steadily under her, not because he was forced to, but because she had given him a reason to choose it. She walked back toward the edge of town with her leather folder under her arm and May on one side and Eli on the other, and the cold air was clean and direct against her face. And somewhere behind her in the hearing room, the story of what had happened was already changing shape as it moved from person to person, becoming the story that Willow Creek would tell about this day for a long time. But the version that mattered was the one that had not yet been written. That one was still ahead of her, and she was walking toward it. The walk home from the hearing took 40 minutes, and Sarah felt every one of them. Not in her legs and her chest, in the specific weighted fullness of a person who has been holding themselves at maximum tension for weeks and has just been told it's over and doesn't quite know how to stop holding yet. May talked the whole way, which was exactly what Sarah needed. May's voice filling the space around her, narrating the expressions on various faces in the hearing room, dissecting Eleanor Marsh's speech, with the appreciative precision of a woman who respected a well-timed public statement, even when it came from someone who had been wrong for a long time. Eli walked on Sarah's other side and said almost nothing, which was also exactly what she needed, because sometimes 14-year-old boys understand things about what people require that grown adults spend decades learning. Black thunder was at the gate when she came through the paddock fence. She hadn't taken off her good dress yet. She didn't care. She put both arms around his neck the way you hold on to something you almost lost, and he stood for. It stood completely still. His great head resting over her shoulder, breathing slow and even against her back. May watched from the fence. She didn't say anything for once. That evening, after May had gone home and Eli had gone home, and the farm was quiet, Sarah sat at Daniel's desk and did not write anything, and did not read anything, and did not plan anything. She just sat. The lantern burned. The house settled around her. Outside, she could hear the horse moving unhurried in the paddock. She allowed herself to feel it, the whole complicated weight of it. The relief, the exhaustion, the grief that was always underneath everything, always present, even when everything was going right. The grief that was shaped like Daniel, and did not get smaller with time, only more familiar. She allowed herself to feel the loneliness too, which she did not usually allow, because loneliness was the one that could become something dangerous if you looked at it too long. She let herself have it for 10 minutes. Then she closed it back up the way you close a drawer you need to be able to open but cannot live with standing open all the time. And she went to bed and slept without interruption for the first time in 3 weeks. The next morning she was up at 4, and the pump needed attention again, and the north fence had a post that had shifted overnight, and she fixed both before the sun was properly up. And she was glad of it, glad of the specific and irreducible realness of things that need to be fixed, because the world asking things of her was how she knew she was still in it, and moving forward, and not standing still. Richard Caldwell left Willow Creek on a Wednesday, 11 days after the hearing. He did not announce his departure. He simply stopped being present in the places he had previously been present, and then his name appeared in connection with a land speculation arrangement in Billings that suggested he had found another county to operate in, which was both a relief and a reminder that the particular brand of man he was did not stop being what he was because one judge in one county had ruled against him once. He had walked away from Dalton's failures clean. He would walk away from this clean too, or clean enough, and find somewhere else to build another version of the same scheme. This bothered Sarah more than she let herself show. She said as much to May 2 weeks after the hearing, sitting in May's kitchen on a Sunday afternoon. "He's just going to do it somewhere else," she said. "To someone else." "Probably," May said with the brisk acceptance of a woman who has lived long enough to understand that some things don't get fixed, only moved. "But not here, not to you." "That doesn't feel like enough." "No," May agreed. "It don't. But it's what you've got, and you've got a farm to run, and a horse to finish training, and spring coming, so you might as well take the win you have and get moving." Sarah took the win she had and got moving. December came in hard that year, the kind that reminded everyone in the territory that Montana did not moderate itself for human convenience. The cold was sustained and serious, the kind that made every task take twice as long and cost twice as much effort, and produced in Sarah a routine of economy that became almost meditative. Everything done in the right order. Nothing wasted, the farm running with the taut efficiency of a system where there was no margin for anything to be wrong. She kept working with Black Thunder through all of it. Cold was not, it turned out, a problem for him. He was a horse built for Montana winters, thick through the chest and neck, moving through the cold paddock with an ease that suggested he found the temperature clarifying rather than difficult. What he had not fully encountered before was working in different conditions. Wind, unexpected sounds, the particular way a winter morning played tricks with sound and light and shadow that could startle an animal that had not been taught to expect the unexpected. Sarah taught him to expect the unexpected. She did this slowly, methodically, the way she did everything with him, by introducing new things carefully and consistently, and always within the context of his trust in her, so that when something strange appeared in his world, the first thing he looked for was her, and when he found her standing steady and unworried, he had a reason to be steady and unworried too. She started small, a flag moved by the wind, a bucket that fell and rolled, Eli appearing suddenly over the fence rail in a hat that Black Thunder had not seen before, and which he regarded with brief, earnest suspicion before deciding it was not a threat. Eli started coming every day rather than just Saturdays, which was the kind of thing that happens without being decided when a young person finds something that holds their entire attention. His mother, Sarah, had worked long hours and worried about him in the distracted, guilty way of a person who does not have enough time to do all the worrying that the situation deserves, and she had come by the farm one afternoon in December to see what was absorbing so much of her son's time. Her name was Clara, and she was younger than Sarah had expected, early 30s, with Eli's same watchful eyes and a quality of exhaustion around them that Sarah recognized as the specific exhaustion of someone doing everything alone. Sarah had given her coffee and shown her Black Thunder and let Eli show his mother what he'd learned to do with the horse, which was considerable. By now, he had a natural ease with the animal that Turner, on one of his increasingly frequent visits, had said was better than most grown men he'd trained. Clara had watched her son moving quietly around that enormous black horse, with the horse's full attention following him like a compass needle, and she had not said much, but her hands had loosened around her coffee cup, and something in her face had changed. The way faces change when a person stops holding something they'd been holding without knowing it. Before she left, Clara had said to Sarah quietly while Eli was occupied at the gate, "He's different since he started coming here." "He's remarkable," Sarah said. "You've got a remarkable son." Clara had looked at her with the slightly startled expression of a woman who is not told things like this often enough. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you for letting him have this." Sarah had wanted to say, "He's giving as much as he's getting." She thought Clara might not quite believe it yet, so she just nodded. Turner came by on a Thursday in mid-December, which had become a regular enough occurrence that Black Thunder had stopped noting his arrival with any particular attention. Turner had changed since the hearing in the specific, undramatic way that honest men change when they've done something honest, not radically different, not performatively remade, just quieter in the old certainties and more willing to ask questions than announce conclusions. He came to look at the horse and stayed to talk about the spring. Willow Creek holds a horse exhibition in May, he said, leaning on the paddock fence with his coffee cup. "Been doing it for 12 years. Ranchers come from 2 counties over. It's where people buy and sell and assess bloodlines, and it's where reputations in this territory get made and unmade." He paused. "I think you should enter Black Thunder." Sarah looked at him. "The whole county knows the story," Turner said. "What they don't know, what most of them have never seen, is what he actually is. What he can do when he's right." He looked at the horse, who was standing at the paddock fence, with his head over the rail, ears forward, watching Turner with the calm, assessing intelligence that had become his characteristic expression. "You show him in that exhibition, everything changes. People who couldn't tell you his name right now will know it. People who want the kind of bloodline he represents will come to you." He turned back to Sarah. "That water spring on your western fence is worth money to the right kind of operation. But a breeding line from an animal like him, properly established, that's worth a great deal more, and it's worth it on your terms, not somebody else's. Sarah listened. She was quiet for a moment. "You've been thinking about this for a while," she said. "Since the hearing," he said. "Maybe before." She looked at Black Thunder. "He's not ready for an exhibition yet," she said. "May is 5 months away," Turner said. "Then I'd better get started." What followed was the hardest and most focused period of work Sarah had ever done in her life, and that was a high bar. The farm still needed everything. The farm always needed, and December and January did not offer concessions to ambition. There were days when the cold was such that the work with Black Thunder was reduced to groundwork, only the two of them moving together in the barn with its inadequate heat, building the language between them, with small precise requests and consistent responses. The invisible architecture of a partnership that was going to have to hold up in front of a crowd. Turner helped. This surprised Sarah, though perhaps it shouldn't have. He began appearing on Tuesday and Thursday mornings with the straightforward purpose of someone who has decided to be useful and requires no particular acknowledgement for it. He did not take over. He understood with a horsemanship that was real, even if it had previously been applied in the wrong direction, that Black Thunder's relationship was with Sarah, and that his role was to support that relationship rather than replace it. He suggested, he observed. He occasionally said, "Try this." And what he suggested was usually worth trying. Reed came back once in January. He came to tell her that he had given a written statement to the county land office regarding Caldwell's prior dealings, a voluntary addition to the record that he had initiated himself and that had no immediate legal consequence, but created a paper trail that future complaints or investigations could use. He explained this in the practical tone of a man doing a practical thing. But Sarah understood what it cost him, because she had understood from the beginning what it cost him to say anything at all. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "No," he agreed. "But the next person he goes after might need it." She thought about Clara working long hours at the hotel. She thought about Gerald Prentice at the bank, uncomfortable and complicit. She thought about all the people in every county in this territory who were in situations they didn't have the resources to fight, who didn't have a Henry Alcott, or a Thomas Reed, or a May Thorne, or a Caleb Turner, who showed up at the last minute and chose the right thing. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once. Then he looked at the horse. "Can I—" He stopped, started again. "Can I come see him? Just to see him?" "Of course," Sarah said. She brought Black Thunder to the fence, and Reed stood with his hands at his sides, and the horse came forward. Not to Reed, not directly, but close enough, and Reed reached out with a slow, careful hand and touched the horse's nose with his fingertips, just for a second, just enough. Reed's jaw was tight the whole time. When Black Thunder moved away to investigate something at the other end of the fence, Reed said without looking at Sarah, "He was the finest young horse I ever worked with, before." "He still is," Sarah said, "just more so now." Reed looked at her. "He knows things that horses that were never hurt don't know," she said. "About trust, about what it costs, about what it means." She paused. "That ain't nothing." Reed left without saying much more, but he left differently than he'd arrived, and Sarah thought that was probably enough for now. February brought the first real test. It came from a direction she hadn't expected, which was usually how the real tests came. She had ridden Black Thunder outside the paddock for the first time in January along the fence line of the south pasture, slow and deliberate, feeling the difference between the enclosed security of the paddock and the open expanse of the actual world. He had handled it better than she'd dared hope, settling into the same quality of attention he showed in the paddock, that focused, intelligent responsiveness that was becoming his signature. She had been extending the range gradually, building his confidence in the wider world. The same way she had built it in the smaller one, incrementally, consistently, always with enough success to end on. In early February, she rode him into town for the first time. She had planned it carefully. She chose a Tuesday morning when the main street was quiet, when most of the commerce was happening later in the day. She asked Eli to ride ahead on May's old mare, and let her know if anything unusual was happening that would make the environment unpredictable. She told May, and May positioned herself at the edge of the main street near the dry goods store with a calm, authoritative presence that Sarah trusted to moderate the situation if the situation needed moderating. They rode down the main street at a walk. Black Thunder's head was up, ears moving, taking in everything. The new smells, the sounds, the visual complexity of a main street at moderate activity. She felt the alertness in him, the sharpened attention, the potential energy of an animal in an unfamiliar environment. She kept her own body loose and confident because he read her the way he read everything completely and immediately, and if she tensed, he would know. She talked to him, low, steady, conversational, not commands, just her voice being a familiar thing in an unfamiliar place. They made it to the end of the main street without incident. Then a dog ran out from between two buildings, barking with the maximum energy dogs apply to horses they have just noticed. Black Thunder shied left fast and hard. Sarah stayed on him, stayed on. Not elegantly. She was off her center for a second, her weight catching up with his movement a beat behind, and in that second she felt the familiar cold clarity of a moment that is either going to be fine or not fine, and you won't know which until it resolves. She brought her weight back, kept her hands quiet, kept her voice steady, and felt him come back under her, not instantly, not without cost, but he came back. He stopped. He blew out through his nose, the long, uncertain exhale that meant he was deciding something. She sat very still and let him decide. He decided to stay. From the doorway of the dry goods store, Eleanor Marsh watched this happen. She watched the horse shy and the woman hold and the horse settle, and then she watched something that probably only people who knew horses could fully read, the moment when an animal in a difficult situation finds the thing it trusts and chooses it over its own fear. Eleanor Marsh went back inside her store. 10 minutes later, she came out with a sign in the window that Sarah would only see when she rode back past on her way home. It was not much of a sign. It said in Eleanor's pragmatic handwriting, "We're glad you're here, Mrs. Whitmore." Sarah read it on the way past. She didn't stop because she was focused on the horse and the street and the work of the moment. But she carried it home with her, and that evening she thought about it for a while, and about the strange, slow, non-linear way that communities absorb the truth about themselves. Not all at once, not with a grand announcement, but in small individual moments, person by person, one honest sign in one window at a time. March brought mud and the real beginning of the work. Turner came every Tuesday and Thursday without exception, and he brought with him the particular expertise of a man who had spent his professional life preparing horses for public demonstration. Not just training, but presentation. The specific craft of showing an animal's quality to an audience that ranged from expert to completely uninformed, of making what you had built together legible to people who hadn't been there for the building. He taught Sarah things she hadn't known she didn't know. The first was pace. She had been working at the pace Black Thunder needed for healing, which was the right pace for healing. But exhibition work required something additional. The ability to move confidently through different gaits. Transitions, figures. The fundamental vocabulary of formal horsemanship, with a fluency that read not as obedience, but as conversation. Black Thunder had the intelligence for it. He had always had the intelligence for it. What he needed was someone to teach him that the conversation was safe to have. He learned fast. Faster than Turner had expected, which Sarah could tell, because Turner's commentary shifted from encouraging to something closer to genuine professional admiration, which from Turner was a fundamentally different register. "He's retaining everything," Turner said one morning, watching Sarah put Black Thunder through a series of transitions at the trot. "Most horses, you introduce something new, and they've got it for that session, and then you're building it back up the next day. He's carrying it forward. Yesterday is still in him." "I know," Sarah said. "That's unusual," Turner said. "I know that too." "Where did he come from?" Turner said. And she understood he meant not the history she already knew, but the deeper history, the breeding, the blood. Because that kind of mind doesn't come from nowhere. It was a question she had begun quietly investigating through the same network of letters and careful inquiries that had produced so much of what she knew about him already. The breeding farm in Miles City had records. She had written to them in January, and the reply had arrived in late February, and she had read it twice and set it aside, and was still figuring out what to do with it. She brought Black Thunder back to the gate and got down and told Turner what the letter had said. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "If that bloodline is documented, and if you can show it at the exhibition—" "I know," Sarah said. "Sarah." He said her name, not Mrs. Whitmore, for the first time, and the informality of it registered as a measure of how much had changed. "That horse is worth more than your farm. Not the land, not the water rights. Him. What he is, what he can produce. If you establish him as a breeding stallion with documented bloodlines at that exhibition, you are not talking about surviving. You are talking about something else entirely." Sarah looked at Black Thunder. He was looking back at her with those dark, serious, completely present eyes. "I know," she said. She said it quietly, and she meant it quietly, because the size of the thing. Turner was describing the size of what was actually possible. What had been walking around in her paddock all this time was not something she wanted to greet with noise. It required something more careful than noise. It required the same thing. Everything with this horse had always required patience and honesty, and the willingness to take the next step without knowing exactly where it landed. April moved through fast. The exhibition was 6 weeks out, then 4, then 2. Eli was helping with the grooming work now, learning the specific attention to detail that exhibition preparation required, and he brought to it the same focused care he brought to everything connected with the horse. May had somehow appointed herself the authority on Sarah's appearance for the event, an appointment Sarah had not granted but had decided not to contest because May's opinions on these matters were generally correct, and Sarah had enough to think about. Turner was there almost daily in the final weeks. He ran them through simulations of exhibition conditions, noise movement, the presence of multiple horses nearby, the particular energy of a crowd that an animal with Black Thunder's history needed to be prepared for. The horse handled all of it. He handled it not perfectly. There were moments, edges of tension that required managing, brief returns of the old alertness that lived just beneath the surface, and perhaps always would. But he handled it with the reliability of an animal who knew who he was, and knew who he was with, and had decided that was enough. The night before the exhibition, Sarah did not sleep again. This time it was not anxiety. Or it was not only anxiety. It was something larger. The feeling of a thing that has been in process for a long time, arriving finally at its moment of declaration, the peculiar suspension of a person who has done the work, and now has only to step forward and let the work be seen. She went to the paddock at midnight. He was awake. She thought he might be. He had seemed in the final days of preparation to track her emotional state with a precision that sometimes seemed uncanny, and she understood in the rational part of her mind that this was not uncanny at all, but simply the natural result of months of attentive connection, the horse having learned to read her the way she had learned to read him, both of them literate in each other now in a way that had been built, one patient hour at a time. She stood at the gate in the dark, and he came to her, and she put her forehead against his nose, and they stayed like that for a while. "Whatever happens tomorrow," she said, "you've already done the remarkable thing. You already did it months ago, the first time you walked toward me instead of away." She felt him breathe against her hands. "Everything after that is just showing people what was already true." He exhaled slowly. She went back inside. In the morning, they were ready. She was dressed by 5, not the navy blue this time, because this was not a legal proceeding, and did not require that kind of armor. It was the good tan riding jacket, worn soft at the elbows, that had been Daniel's mother's, before it was hers, and her best boots, and her hair done simply and correctly, and she looked in the small mirror over the washstand, and saw a woman she recognized, which had not always been the case in the past year and a half. She saw someone who had been tested and had not broken. She saw someone who had looked at a thing the whole world called worthless, and had known better. She walked out to the paddock. Black Thunder turned from the fence to face her, and his whole posture was the posture she had been watching build over months. Not the rigid terror of an animal braced for harm, not the explosive readiness of a creature who had learned to fight as survival, but the easy, alert, forward presence of a horse who knew his own strength and was not afraid of it. He walked to her without hesitation. She put her hand on his neck. "All right," she said. "Let's go show them." She led him out of the gate for the last time, as the horse nobody believed in, and pointed them both toward what came next. The road into Willow Creek that May morning was the same road Sarah had walked 4 miles of in the opposite direction 8 months ago, leading a trembling black stallion away from an auction yard full of people who were laughing at her. She had been on foot then, walking beside him, because she hadn't earned the right to ride him yet. She was riding him now, and the difference between those 2 moments was the whole story of everything that had happened in between. Black Thunder moved under her with the unhurried confidence of an animal who had been somewhere very dark and had found his way back to himself. His stride was long and even his head carried naturally, his ears moving with relaxed interest at the sounds coming from the town ahead. The noise of a gathering crowd, the distant calls of vendors, the particular layered energy of a community event that had drawn people from 2 counties over and was still drawing them. Sarah felt all of it through him, every sound registering in his body, every new smell, every shift in the air, and she felt also his decision each time to stay steady, to consult her with the slight half-check of attention that had become their shared language, and to accept her steadiness as the answer. She had been afraid getting up that morning, that she would feel the fear she'd felt before the hearing. That tight, high structural tension of someone whose entire situation was balanced on what was about to happen. She didn't feel that. What she felt was something quieter and more grounded, something closer to the way she felt in the best moments of working with Black Thunder, present, attentive, aware of the size of the thing without being crushed by it. Eli rode May's old mare 15 feet behind her, which he had appointed himself to do, without being asked, the way he had appointed himself to most of the things he now did in the operation of Sarah's farm. He was 15, in 2 weeks taller than he'd been in the fall, by what looked like 3 inches, and he had the particular seriousness of a young person who has found the thing that matters to him and is devoting himself to it with the whole force of his attention. He didn't speak on this ride in, neither did she. They had said what needed saying in the barn at 5 in the morning, which was very little, and the silence between them now was the comfortable silence of 2 people who had been through something together and didn't need to narrate it. May had gone ahead the previous evening for reasons she described as organizational, and which Sarah understood to mean that May intended to have a complete intelligence picture of the exhibition grounds before Sarah arrived, and was not willing to trust anyone else with this task. Turner had gone ahead too earlier that morning to register Black Thunder's entry and handle the documentation, and also, Sarah suspected, to begin the quiet work of managing the information environment. Turner, knowing who was there, who mattered, who should see what and when, the social architecture of a professional reputation being built in real time. The exhibition grounds were at the edge of town, a large flat area that the county used twice a year for events of this kind. By the time Sarah rode in through the main entrance at 8:30, there were already more people than she had seen in one place since she'd arrived in Willow Creek. She recognized faces, many of them, from the hearing and the main street and the dry goods store and the church, and the accumulated social life of 8 months in a small town that had been watching her closely for most of that time. She also saw faces she didn't know, ranchers and horse people and cattle investors, and what looked like 2 men with the careful assessing air of professional buyers who had come from somewhere with money to spend and specific criteria in mind. She felt the shift the moment people saw the horse. It was not loud. It was not a single moment. It was the way a change in temperature moves through a room. The person nearest the door feels it first, then the next person, then the next, until the whole space has registered that something has entered that was not there before. Black Thunder moving through that crowd with his head up and his coat dark and brilliant in the May morning light was not the same animal that anyone in Willow Creek had seen being loaded out of Harrington's ranch yard 8 months ago, and even the people who knew the story only from the outside could see that immediately and completely. A man near the entrance said something to the woman beside him that Sarah couldn't hear. The woman turned to look at the horse, and her expression moved from polite attention to something more concentrated. Turner materialized at her left stirrup with the smooth, unobtrusive efficiency he'd been developing over months of working alongside her. "You're in the third group," he said quietly. "2 other stallions ahead of you. The judges are from Helena. 2 of them don't know the local history, which is good. They'll see what's in front of them. And the third judge, Arthur Connolly. He's been judging this exhibition for 7 years. He knew Harrington." Turner paused. "He also attended the hearing." Sarah absorbed this. "Where are we holding before the group?" "East Paddock. I'll take you through." He walked beside her through the crowd, and she became aware, as they moved, of the particular quality of the attention following them. Not the buzzing, slightly cruel attention of 8 months ago at Harrington's auction yard, but something different. Something with more weight and less certainty in it. The attention of people who are revising something they thought they knew. She heard her name twice, said quietly not to her. She didn't turn. Horatio Burns from the hardware store stepped forward from the edge of the path and touched his hat. "Good morning, Mrs. Whitmore," he said. "Fine-looking horse." "Thank you, Mr. Burns," she said. He stepped back. It was a small thing. It was not a small thing. In the East Paddock, she dismounted and let Black Thunder move and settle, watching how he was reading the environment. The paddock was adjacent to the main exhibition ring, and the sounds from the ring crowd noise announcements. The movement of other horses came over the fence in irregular waves that were exactly the kind of thing they had practiced for. He tracked each wave with his ears checked in with her each time, and went back to his own investigation of the immediate surroundings when she gave him nothing to be concerned about. Eli took the mare to the holding area and came back to the paddock fence and watched without comment. May arrived 12 minutes later, slightly out of breath, with the expression of someone who has completed a reconnaissance mission and is organizing her report. "Eleanor Marsh is here," she said. "She brought her sister from Billings. The sister apparently raises quarter horses and heard about this animal last month and made the trip specifically." May looked at the horse, then at Sarah. "There's also a man named Garrett Frank Garrett, out of Helena, who buys for one of the larger breeding operations in the territory. Turner knows who he is. He's been asking questions about the entry." Sarah kept her expression neutral. "What kind of questions?" "The kind that mean he came here already knowing something about what you've got and wants to know more." May straightened her jacket. "I'm just saying." "I know what you're saying, May. I'm saying it anyway because I'm old and I've earned the right." Sarah almost smiled. "Is there anything I actually need to handle right now?" "No, everything is where it should be." May looked at her with the direct, clear-eyed assessment of a woman who had watched this entire thing from the beginning. "You ready?" "Yes." "Good." May patted her arm once briskly, the way May expressed most of what she felt. "Then go show these people what you've built." The first 2 groups moved through the ring while Sarah waited. She didn't watch them from the paddock. She stayed focused on Black Thunder, on the quality of his attention, on maintaining the calm, grounded presence that he used as his reference point when the world got complex. Turner came back twice with updates that were essentially the same update. The crowd was attentive. The judges were paying close attention. The 2 stallions that had gone ahead were good horses, both handled well. "Better than good?" Sarah asked. Turner considered this with the honesty he'd developed over months of being honest about things he'd previously been certain about. "One of them is very good," he said. "A gray out of the Hendrickson operation. The judges spent extra time on him. He's been shown before. He knows how to be shown." Sarah nodded. "Black Thunder is better," Turner said. Just that. Just the flat professional statement offered without drama, which was the most credible version of those 3 words she could have received. Her group was called at 10:30. She mounted in the East Paddock, took a breath that she let all the way out, and rode through the gate into the ring. The ring held maybe 200 people around its perimeter, which was more than she had prepared for and less than she was going to let matter. She was aware of them the way she was aware of weather-present real something to account for, but not to be governed by. What she focused on was the horse beneath her, and the 15 feet of ground in front of them, and the quality of the conversation they were having. The same conversation they'd been having for 8 months, conducted in weight and breath and the precise language of two beings who had learned each other completely. Black Thunder walked into the ring like he owned it. Not with arrogance, with the particular ease of an animal who is entirely at home in his own body and has no reason to be otherwise. His stride opened up in the larger space, his head coming to the natural brilliant carriage that she'd been watching develop for months, and that, Turner said with the reverence of a man who had been in horses his whole life, was one of the finest natural head carriages he had ever seen on a living animal. The crowd noise dropped. Not to silence, to the concentrated near silence of a large group of people giving their complete attention to something. She moved him through the walk, feeling the rhythm of him, feeling his pleasure in the work. Because it was pleasure she had come to understand, genuine pleasure in movement and precision and the partnership of it. The horse enjoying what he was good at in the way that any creature enjoys being fully itself. She asked for the trot and got it immediately smooth and forward. His hocks driving under him with the power of an animal built for exactly this, and she heard the change in the crowd even over the sound of his hoofbeats. Heard it go from attentive to something more than attentive, the particular held quality of 200 people seeing something they were not prepared for. The 3 judges stood at the center of the ring on a small raised platform. She was aware of their positioning without looking at them directly. The 2 from Helena, who she didn't know, and Arthur Connolly, who she did. She brought Black Thunder past the judge's platform at the trot, and felt him check in with her as they came level with it. The brief, almost imperceptible hesitation of an animal noting something new and important. And she kept her own body completely still and forward, and he moved past it without breaking stride. One of the Helena judges said something to Connolly in a low voice. Connolly's eyes followed the horse around the ring. She asked for the canter. This was the moment she had worked toward longest, the gait that had taken the most patience and the most precision to build, because the canter was where everything showed balance. Collection, the horse's relationship with his own power, the rider's ability to be with the horse rather than on him. Black Thunder had cantered beautifully in training for months. He had cantered beautifully in the exhibition simulations Turner had run. He had cantered down the south pasture fence line on winter mornings, with the floating, ground-covering stride of a horse that had found exactly what he was meant to do. He cantered now with everything he had. The sound from the crowd was immediate and unmistakable. Not applause yet. Something pre-applause. Something involuntary. The collective audible intake of 200 people seeing something exceptional and not being able to stay quiet about it. She heard it as a kind of confirmation that resonated with everything she already knew. Not something she needed to hear, but something she was glad to hear, because this was not only about her, and this was not only about the horse, and it never had been. This was about what was true, and the truth required witnesses, and the witnesses were here. She brought him back to the walk. She made one more full circuit of the ring, letting him breathe, letting the crowd breathe, letting the judges make their notes. Then she brought him to a halt in the center of the ring, facing the judge's platform, and he stood square still, collected his breathing, coming and going evenly. His attention completely present, his whole body communicating everything that 200 people had just watched them build. The ring was almost completely quiet. From somewhere at the edge of the crowd, she heard a single pair of hands start clapping. Then another. Then the whole crowd. And it was not polite or obligatory, it was the real thing. The sound of people who have seen something they did not expect and are responding to it with the whole of their feeling. She did not allow herself to feel it fully yet. She kept her body still and her face composed and her attention on the horse, because the horse was still in the ring and the ring was still active and her job was not finished. But something in her chest moved. She rode out of the ring and dismounted at the east paddock gate, and her hands were shaking. Not from fear. She held them still against Black Thunder's neck until they steadied. Turner was there. He said nothing. He took the horse's reins so she could step back and breathe, and he held the horse and looked at the ground for a moment, and when he looked up, his eyes were bright in the way that men who have spent their whole lives being certain about things are bright when something breaks through that certainty and gets to the real person underneath. Well, he said. Well, she said. Eli appeared at the paddock fence. He was holding himself very still in the way he did when something was too large for normal response. There are people coming, he said. A lot of people. That man Turner mentioned Garrett. He's one of them. Sarah straightened her jacket. She took a breath. All right, she said. Frank Garrett was a compact man of 50, weathered and direct with the economical manner of someone for whom time is a resource he does not waste. He came to the paddock fence with two men she didn't know, and looked at Black Thunder with the specific technical attention of a professional buyer who is trying to separate what he feels from what he knows, and weigh them both accurately. Mrs. Whitmore, he said. Frank Garrett. Helena Breeding Association. He did not extend pleasantries beyond that. I need to ask you directly about the bloodline documentation, because what I just watched in that ring doesn't match the price point this animal was acquired at, and I want to understand the discrepancy. The bloodline documentation is complete, Sarah said. I received the verification from the Miles City breeding farm in February. The dam line traces directly to... She said the name and watched Garrett's expression shift fractionally in the way that the expression of a man who already knows the answer shifts when he hears it confirmed. One of the men behind him said something to the other in a voice too low to catch. Garrett looked at Black Thunder for another long moment. Then he looked at Sarah. How did an animal with that lineage end up at an auction yard in Ravalli County selling for $1? Because someone with money and no patience destroyed his trust, Sarah said. And because by the time he arrived in this county, everyone who looked at him saw the destruction, and none of them looked past it. Garrett was quiet. Except you, he said. Except me, she agreed. He was quiet for another moment. I'd like to discuss terms, he said. Not acquisition. I understand from Turner that the animal is not for sale, and I'm not going to insult you by arguing the point. I'm talking about a breeding arrangement, formal, documented, structured appropriately. He met her eyes with the direct regard of a man who has done a lot of business and knows what he's looking at. What you have here is not a recovered horse, Mrs. Whitmore. What you have is a bloodline that the territory thought it had lost in an animal in the best condition of his life, with documentation, with a provenance story that every serious horse person in Montana is going to know by the end of this week. He paused. I'm asking to be part of what comes next. Sarah looked at him. She looked at the horse. She looked at Turner, who gave her nothing, deliberately, specifically holding his face neutral in the particular way that meant this was her call, and he was not going to help her make it. I'll want everything in writing, she said. Through my attorney in Helena, full documentation, my terms on breeding rights, my control over selection. Agreed, Garrett said without hesitation. Then we can talk, Sarah said. Garrett nodded once, a short decisive nod, and stepped back, and Sarah understood that what had just happened in those 40 seconds was the kind of thing that took most people years to achieve, and that she had arrived at through a path that had almost nothing to do with strategy, and almost everything to do with refusing to see an animal the way everyone else had decided to see him. She turned back to the horse. He was watching her with his ears forward and his eyes quiet, and that specific expression she had come to think of as his, the expression of a horse who is fully present and fully himself, and is choosing to be here with her in this life they had built together, out of nothing but time and patience and the willingness to believe in something nobody else was bothering to believe in. The exhibition results were announced at 2 o'clock. Sarah stood at the paddock fence with Black Thunder at her shoulder and listened to the announcer read through the categories, and when the Stallion class was called and Black Thunder's name was read first, she heard the crowd respond with a sound that was different from polite applause. It had something personal in it, something that a community makes when it is recognizing not just an outcome, but a story, when it is applauding, not just what happened in the ring, but what it took to get there. Connolly came to find her afterward. He was a careful man. Arthur Connolly, careful in the way of people who have been wrong publicly before and have learned the specific caution that produces. He stopped at the paddock fence and looked at Black Thunder for a while before he spoke. "I owe you an honest statement," he said finally. "You don't owe me anything," Sarah said. "I was at the hearing," he said, as if she hadn't spoken. "I heard what Turner said. I heard what Reed said. And I'd been telling people for months that the horse you bought was proof you didn't know what you were doing." He kept his eyes on the horse. "I was wrong about the horse. I was wrong about you. And I said enough wrong things to enough people that I think I ought to say the right thing now clearly to someone who was here." Sarah looked at him. "I hear you," she said, "and I accept it." He looked at her then, and what was in his face was the complicated thing that honest reckonings produce, not comfortable, not resolved, but real. "What are you going to do now?" he asked. "With the operation, with all of this?" Sarah thought about the farm. She thought about the spring on the western fence that was hers to use and to protect. She thought about Garrett's offer, and Alcott's letters, and the breeding documentation from Miles City, and all the pieces of what was being built quietly and without fanfare on a parcel of land that a man with money had spent months trying to take from her. She thought about a black horse in a paddock on a cold November morning, learning that the world could contain something other than pain. "I'm going to build something," she said. "Something that lasts." She meant the breeding operation. She meant the farm. She meant the thing she was only beginning to see the full shape of the possibility of using this land and this horse and everything she had learned to create something that other people could benefit from. She had been thinking since the winter about the animals she had seen over the course of the past year, horses at other farms, horses at the auction yards. Animals that were not as damaged as Black Thunder had been, but that shared some quality of being mishandled or misunderstood or simply not seen correctly by the people responsible for them. She had been thinking about what it would mean to have a place where those animals could come, where the approach she had developed with Black Thunder, not as a method, not as a system, but as a practice. The daily patient practice of listening and consistency and respect could be applied to other animals and taught to other people. She had said none of this out loud yet, but she had been saying it to herself in the quiet hours at Daniel's desk for months. Connolly nodded as if he could see some of it, even from what little she'd said. He touched his hat and left. May found her when the crowd had thinned in the late afternoon, with the light going amber and the noise of the exhibition grounds settling into the quieter noise of a day coming to its end. May looked at her with the full, unguarded expression she usually kept behind briskness, and said, "How do you feel?" Sarah considered the question honestly. "Like something that was supposed to be over isn't over," she said. "Like this is a beginning." "It is," May said simply. Eli came with the mare from the holding area and fell into step beside them as they began the walk back toward the road, and Sarah rode Black Thunder out of the exhibition grounds the way she had ridden him in, with the same quality of attention, the same conversation between them, the same easy language of two beings who knew each other and had chosen each other and were not going back. On the road home she let him move at his own pace, which was forward and willing. The town was behind them. The farm was ahead. The spring on the western fence was exactly where it had always been, and the barn roof was solid, and the pump was working correctly, and the north fence line was standing straight. In the months that followed, Frank Garrett's arrangement formalized. The first inquiries came from a breeding operation in Billings, then another from outside of Miles City. By midsummer, Black Thunder had been established as what he was, not what he had appeared to be. Not what the worst year of his life had made people believe he was, but what he had always been underneath all of it, an animal of exceptional quality, of rare intelligence and lineage, whose story had somehow become the story that people in this territory told when they wanted to talk about what patience was actually worth. Sarah hired Eli officially in July with Clara's blessing and a formal arrangement that covered his time and contributed to his future, because what he had was not the skill of a hired hand, but the gift of someone who genuinely understood animals, and gifts like that deserved to be taken seriously. She took on her first rescued horse in August, a bay mare from a property 40 miles east abandoned, when her owner left the territory thin and frightened, and standing at the fence of an empty farm, with the particular look of an animal waiting for someone to notice. Sarah went and got her on a Wednesday, and brought her home, and started the work from the beginning, the same beginning. The same first days of sitting nearby and waiting and letting the animal understand that here was a place where patience was the rule and force was not. She named the mare Patience, which May said was on the nose, and which Sarah said was accurate, which was not the same thing as on the nose. Black Thunder was interested in the mare from the beginning, in the specific interested way that a settled animal has in a frightened one. Not predatory, not indifferent, but something attentive and almost deliberate, as if he recognized what she was carrying, and knew from the inside what it was going to take to put it down. Sarah watched him stand at the fence between their paddocks one morning in September, quiet and present, while the bay mare approached in small, uncertain steps, and then retreated, and then approached again. He simply stood, patient, available, asking nothing. She stood behind him at the rail and watched it, and felt the enormous quiet weight of what had happened. Not just what had happened this year, not just the farm and the hearing and the exhibition, and Garrett's offer, and all the machinery of survival and victory that had moved through her life since the morning she put a silver dollar on an auction table. She felt the weight of the whole story from the beginning, from the day she walked toward the most frightened animal in the county, because she recognized something in him that everyone else had decided wasn't worth recognizing. Caleb Turner came by that afternoon and found her at the fence. He looked at Black Thunder and the bay mare for a moment, reading the situation with the expert eye that was now being used in her service rather than in judgment of her. "How long?" he asked. "A week," Sarah said. "Maybe 2. She's coming along." Turner nodded. Then after a moment, "You're going to need more paddock space." "I know." "I could help with that. The fencing." "I know you could," she said. He looked at her. "All right then," he said. And that was the conversation, and it was enough. The work was not finished, and it was never going to be finished, because the kind of work Sarah was doing was not the kind that ends when one animal was healed, or one farm was saved, or one man's scheme was defeated in a courtroom. It was the kind that expanded. It was the kind that, once begun, showed you more of itself. The further in you went, more animals, more people, more of the particular human need for proof that the things we give up on did not have to be given up on, that the cost of patience is always less than the cost of turning away. But the work was hers. The land was hers. The horse was hers. And standing at that fence on a September morning, with Black Thunder steady at the rail and the frightened mare taking one more small step toward him, and the whole of what she had built stretching out around her in every direction, Sarah Whitmore knew something that she was going to spend the rest of her life proving to anyone who needed to see it, that what the world throws away is not worthless. That what the world calls broken is not always broken. Sometimes it is only waiting with the specific, inexhaustible patience of something that has not yet given up on being found. And that sometimes all it takes is one person willing to look past what everyone else has decided they're seeing to pay what no one else is willing to pay, and to stay, to simply, stubbornly, courageously stay until the truth of what's actually there has room enough to finally show itself. She had stayed. And the proof of it was standing right in front of her head, raised whole and steady, and entirely himself. That was enough. That was everything. That,